The Butterfly's Dream by Kerberos 314, Chapter 7, second person perspective. Dear Ruby, I know that you must have seen everything that happened today. After all that, I hope that you are reading this and I hope I can explain. You've been with me so long that I keep thinking that you understand whatever I am doing, whatever I'm going through. I don't give a second thought to how it must look to you, how my actions must look to someone outside. But I can't do that anymore. I can't ignore that you're a different person and you're stuck with me. I want to do right by myself, but I also want to do right by you too. Right now, I feel like I failed that. I feel like if your father or sister were here, they'd never forgive me. I just need to know if you will. Say, Naruto. Hmm? The sound of grinding stopped, piercing the morning calm with a ringing shriek. You never did tell me why you picked up the Kusarigama. I don't remember you ever using it in the academy. The boy smiled and lifted the weapon above his head, closing one eye and looking down the blade as the sunlight streamed down from the treetops, lit up the flawless curvature. Meh, no reason, just seemed natural. Natural? Mm-hmm. He wound the chain around his body and carefully holstered the blade in a leather scabbard which hung off his hip. She narrowed her eyes and leaned over him ominously, half a smirk forming on her lips. I knew it. Knew what? An unconscious twitch in his neck, dread that she could see the second conscious behind his wide, fearful eyes, even though he suspected she was probably just playing with him, like usual. You really are a prodigy. He blew her a raspberry and stood up, seeing their third member emerge from the tree line on the opposite side of the clearing. Nope, he said, popping the pea. If that's what one looks like, there's no way I'm a prodigy. Tenten deliberately followed his gaze. Looking over her shoulder, she had probably noticed Neji's approach at the same time he had, and did not start at his materialization. She threw her other teammate a small wave which she knew wasn't going to be reciprocated, and instead turned back to resume her conversation with Naruto. Well then, explain how you're so good. I've only been giving you pointers and you soak those up almost as fast as I can think of them. Sometimes it seems like you already know what to do and just have to be reminded of it. Well, you are a good teacher. He chuckled as she checked his arm playfully, her unique way of showing embarrassment which Ruby linked to her sister. Well, I might have also had some extra lessons. What? From what? She's not in Konoha right now. He regretted seeing the spark of curiosity he helped fan be smothered so quickly, but he didn't want to lead her on with false hopes, and he knew that with the arrival of their third teammate, she would soon have something else to occupy her attention. Tenten, Naruto, the uh, the uh, the aristocratic boy dully acknowledged with a curt nod to each. Onyoho Neji. The reply, however, was singular as Naruto retracted into his cloud of thoughts after Tenten had unwittingly stirred them and hardly registered his name being called. Naruto? Hmm? Tenten's voice reliably returned him to reality, and he looked blankly at her sarcastically expressed face. Neji? She pointed to their teammate who had averted his eyes in a huff of indignation. Oh, right, sorry. Good morning, Neji. I thought Yamato-sensei already had you trained to pay more attention to your surroundings. Yeah, Naruto admitted with limp grin and half-hearted shrug. I knew you were there. You just hardly ever used my name, so I didn't realize you were speaking to me. The three fell into the usual banter and still slightly uncomfortable routine which they had hashed out over several weeks of an off and ongoing, off and again camaraderie camaraderie. They were Tento thought they were improving, as evidenced by Naruto's upgrade from Kohai to Uzumaki, and now finally to the title the blonde had insisted upon all along. In return, Neji was snapping less and less at their youngest member when being addressed informally, and stopped issuing his wearisome sermons on a daily basis. But Naruto could tell that all was not well beneath that veneer. He had seen perfection, and this was not it. Even if he buried his own feelings about Neji underneath the mutual detente, its impertinence was still obvious. It would not last, just like his dreams. It was bound to be shattered. Morning, everyone. The one other person who might have suspected the icebergs beneath the surface popped out from one of the surrounding trees. There was no doubt he had been watching them all along. The only question remained revolved around whether he was ignorant of the social discord or if he expected them to work it out on their own. "Morning, Sensei," came the chorus, and the man adorned one of his perfected smiles as he met with each of their eyes individually. Yamato was no fool. He must be waiting for them to resolve the issue themselves. In a way, it was reassuring to know he trusted them that much. With reaffirmed faith in their capabilities to overcome, Naruto straightened up and demanded cheerfully, "So, what are we doing today, Sensei?" Whatever confidence he had just gained wavered slightly as the nail-biting smile delivered in his direction. "I thought we might try a C rank mission today." It's silly, but I wonder what would have happened if our situations were reversed. Would you have become a ninja? Before I wouldn't have to think about it. There was no doubt you there was no doubt you would. You were like me, at least that much. You're strong and you want to protect people. So do I, and that's what I thought I was doing. Do you blame me for being wrong? Is it my fault for ignoring what was right in front of me? Never mind. I don't want to think about that anymore. Your client is a small village 3 clicks west of the coast. They have been complaining about bandits who regularly frequent the Tokaido route, which is a major thoroughfare in and out of the village. The four watched as the old man hotboxed the tobacco in his pipe, letting the leaves flare up in a cloud of aromatic smoke before he set it aside to let it smolder. Because the village is technically in the land of hot springs, which have no shinobi force of their own, they are paying out of pocket for this mission because the government refuses to do anything about it. They are adamant that the taxes paid by the village already go to road maintenance and refuse to do anything because of the already delicate verdict regarding the extent of borders. It was easy to see both sides of the argument. From the eyes of both government and citizens, the only ones obviously at fault being the bandits themselves, and so it was not difficult to rein themselves to the solution. Your job is to eliminate the immediate threat to the village according to your sensei's discretion. The words were harsh to all three sets neophyte eyes and all four young listeners, but they still held out hope, or otherwise assumed that the phrasing could simply mean they would be knocking a few heads together for discouragement. No matter how obvious the alternative was unthinkable, even though it was suspected by at least one. Eliminate the threat was straightforward to Ruby. She'd heard the words frequently in each one of her classes. From history to practical study, it was as callously uttered as it was here, but had always applied to those soulless beasts and never to living people. Your client is waiting in the foyer. He will escort you to the village, whereupon you will move quickly to locate the bandit camp. You will not need to spend overly long in the village itself because of its technical supervision by a foreign government. It could have just been the tenuous political situation, but none bothered to question the Hokage personally overseeing their debriefing. In Ruby's mind, as in Naruto's, the village leader was the grandfatherly old man, and so fit innocently into the role without either of them giving it much thought. Tread carefully. Normally this would be a B rank mission considering the potential consequences, but the village itself can only afford a C rank at the moment, and the actual requirements are not out of your teammates' capabilities. I do not need to tell you that every time you step outside these walls, your village's reputation is at stake. I trust that you will keep this in mind during the task ahead. Hi, Hokage-sama. Ruby found herself ghosting the words along with her counterpart, a comforting familiarity such that duty was. Was it normal for such a grim speech to be given for such a trivial mission? Then again, neither Ruby nor Naruto could claim to know what normal entailed, and the words, like anything else, were meaningless without experience which neither of them had. Remember, you three, Yamato spoke in a tone not unlike the old man's parting words as they exited the stuffy office. Even though the reputation of your village is important, do not let that distract you from staying safe. Always protect your teammates. You should have their back and they should have yours. Hi, Sensei. As the chorus rang out yet again, Ruby couldn't help thinking about her sister. She could trust Yang to do so, but could the three of them claim as strong a bond? They'd only been working together a scant few months, and it hardly compared to the lifetime spent in the company of family. But Ruby herself would one day have to work in the same situation with people even less familiar. That was a scary thought. I didn't ask to be given this life. Neither of us did. That's not an excuse, just a thought. I suppose I could have been a civilian, just like you could have, but that would have been hard in its own way, wouldn't it? And in the end, did either of us really have a choice? The journey was slow and monotonous, which would turn out to be not that bad. It gave Ruby and Naruto plenty of time to marvel at the world outside of Konoha, and even though unbounded forest was not something new to either of them, there was something different about the trail taken now. The way the sunlight filtered through the higher branches, the way the wind blew when it coursed through Naruto's starchy hair, the earth underneath his warmer, stouter body, and the primordial smell of the trees, which was fundamentally different than the virgin forest of Patch. It also gave the two time to think and to write. Little activity during either of their days meant they could spare each other some thought without falling into the trap of distraction. But even then, they had little to say which had not already been said, or they assumed that they did not, content to think that the other already knew the thoughts which ran through the other's head, and like that, meaningless words bridged words, and they found themselves taking for granted each other's extraordinary company. The 3 days of travel would see them safely behind the village's meager walls. It was easy to see why they would need to hire protection. The young men of the town were all involved with the shipping and transporting of salts and minerals from the port cities to resorts further inland, and had no training to speak of. It was not different than what they imagined settlements outside of the kingdoms of Remnant to be like. Meeting with the village mayor and the gathering of intelligence wouldn't take more than a few hours, which went by in a blur, and before their unusual presence was noticed by the population at large, they would already find themselves staring at the rapidly retreating lumber bastions which skirted the settlement, their sensei hot on the trail provided for them, and the three in tow not far behind. Much like the village, the site of the bandit camp was unassuming, but much could be hidden in the darkness, and none were foolish enough to let down their guard. Yamato assumed command as they thought and hoped that he would. It was comforting having an adult who knew what to do, supervising their actions, absolved them of having to think about it. It made Ruby want to think of her father, even though the man clearly was not. But it was still a relief to the feminine personality, as it prevented the potential issue from arising between Naruto and Neji. While the former was perfectly fine to defer to the older boy on the trivial missions thus far, Ruby knew that Naruto had a far larger prideful streak than she herself, and would not take kindly to condescension in such a pricky situation. It was yet another reminder that they were indeed different people. To everyone's great relief, the Jonin sensei planned a strategy for them which involved an overwhelming show of force in order to scare the bandits into sensibility and otherwise incapacitate them should they prove uncooperative. No bloodshed required. Naruto would flicker into the camp and cause as much chaos as possible. Meanwhile, Tenten and Neji would sweep in from south of the small hill and the encampment pitched itself on, driving the denizens to flee rather than stay under cover. Yamato would sit back and let them take care of almost everything, watching from a place of vantage where he could step in should things prove more difficult than assumed. They didn't. When Naruto appeared by the blazing campfire, the whirlwind of leaves he swept with him caught alight and bathed the area in a grand fireball, more light than heat, which startled the swordsman who had been sitting unaware. The result was almost immediate as most scrambled to flee the shock and awe tactic, while a handful of others managed to pick themselves up and charge at him with random assortments of weapons. Their lack of training showed, and soon before the last was defeated the others broke rank and fled into the darkness already ablaze with the sound of panic. Naruto was almost grateful for how easy things seemed to be going. He was honestly a little nervous at first, not of failing, but of losing control. While Ruby could compete with her classmates without blunting their strikes because of their wondrous aura, Naruto had no such buffers available to him, and thus he had to be careful with his weapon while sparring with allies. Though he had elected to do the same now to avoid killing as much as possible, there was always the chance that doing so could get him or his teammates hurt instead, and the words of his sensei unnecessarily replayed over again in his head reminded him that he could not afford to do that. Before the sounds of Neji's gentle fist slaps and Tenten's clang of weapons caught up to him, he pushed further into the camp, disabling and disarming people as he encountered them. It was almost pathetic, in his opinion, how easily they capitulated into disorderly chaos. He began to unwittingly attack with more vindictiveness than he was aware he possessed. The thought of these weak people preying on the only ones weaker than them making his blood boil. At least he was confronted with someone who might prove a challenge, a burly man easily 4 times his meager height, the beast of a man wielding a bludgeon of some kind which was half as big around as he was, but which fit easily into the bear trap grip. He spoke in a thick accent that Naruto didn't even try to comprehend. He also didn't bother to remember the warning he was supposed to give because he doubted the man would listen to a child. He simply blitzed the man second before the club descended onto the space where he once was, lodging in the muddy earth with a dull thunk. Everything had been a blur of battle thus far, and he felt himself almost disappointed that this man appeared no different. He was no Yamato, no Crow, not even on par with his other teammates. So it was for perhaps this reason that as he stood over the crumpled form of the behemoth's body, he allowed his guard to drop even for a minute. He was staring with unknown apathy at the man who was dead asleep when a cry erupted from behind him. He turned in time to see the silver glint of a blade jab out at him from the darkness, and like Crow had not long ago, he reacted instinctively and without remorse. Had it been his instincts alone, he might have gone for a move meant to disable rather than kill, but so long spent emulating Ruby's movements along with his own deep-seated training, it was anyone's guess what the response would be. Thus, it was only half a surprise when his blade passed cleanly through the flimsy kitchen knife and the flesh behind it, and he didn't have time to comprehend what his other senses were telling him of the sounds of meaty rending or the smell of iron dispersing into the air. Kasan! He heard that, though, and his mind immediately translated it to Mother, thrusting him back into the moment when Ruby lost her own mother. He froze, but the person emerging from the darkness had no eyes for him or his solid blade. They threw themselves down on the ground next to the mutilated corpse, where they proceeded to bawl their tawny eyes out. Naruto could do nothing but stare and imagine that it wasn't some gypsy child with dirt mattered hair that he was looking at, but rather a raven haired girl, a sun kissed blonde. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't not see her himself or Ruby. Haruo, another shape, larger this time, tripped over of the hectic night, and also without flicking an eye in Naruto's direction, scooped the young man into his arms. Haruo, you must get away. You can't stay here. Only after he successfully blinded the boy from the horrific sight, pressing him into his emaciated shoulder, did he turn to face the young murderer. Enough! Naruto raised his blade automatically when confronted with the hateful glare the man was sending him, even though he knew he couldn't stomach any more bloodshed. Isn't this enough, Shinobi-san? You've made your point. We'll go and never come back. I promise. You don't have to kill us to remind us we are dogs. We will claw away with our tail behind our legs if you let us. The stranger's mouth spouted a plea, but his eyes said clearly it was a threat as he stared back in imprompt defiance, his calloused hands coddling the scrawny boy. Naruto had no idea what to say, nor what to do after all this, and so stood quietly with his hand clenched around the hand of his weapon. Then go, if it could be considered fortunate. Neji appeared next to and spoke for him. The pale lad concealed Jin seemingly from the darkness. And do not come back, or else I can say with certainty that we will not be as lenient. Naruto wanted to decry the harsh word from his comrade, refute that callous ultimatum spoken on his behalf, but the blood itself was on his hands, and so he had nothing he could say. So cruel. The man spat at the two of them as he rose, but made no move to defy it. I don't know which is worse, the heartlessness you demonstrate, or that of the people who raise you. He was shaking as he whispered these words, shaking the frail boy in his arms. Or you consider us to be the monsters just because we are different? Aye, we steal a bit here and there, and so what if we squat on a public land? We do so to survive, because that's the way we've always done things. He shook his head dismally and seemed to debate whether it was worth talking to the two brainwashed child soldiers. You have no idea what I'm talking about, do you? No, after all, you kids have grown up in one of those hidden villages. You'll never comprehend the freedom of what it's like to live outside their administration. If you do, they'll brand you a missing nin. No, I pity you. We are all caged. Neji hissed back as Naruto disjointed the strangeness of the man's words. From the moment we are born, we are locked into our situations. There is no changing that. To try and exit outside of the law is the same as anarchy, and it is unintendable. I'm beginning to think that. The man was slinking away, his skeletal frame slowly disappearing into the darkness behind the firelight. The sounds of conflict that they noticed had long since died down. We gypsies have a long and proud heritage, but maybe the times have changed and we are doomed as a race. His foreboding smile was the last thing left along the two polished chunks of coal staring out at them from the empty night. One day you too will be confronted with a new reality, whether the old truths don't fit in any more. For your sake, I hope that you are ready for it. And like ghosts, he and the rest of the caravan disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind not a trace of battle, nor indeed that anyone had ever lived there, apart from the gutted husks of caravans which might have been there for centuries. You heard what Yamato Sensei had to say about it. All the larger nations considered them squatters, trash, vagabonds. Smaller nations considered them vermin. They can't tell me what that woman wasn't. They can't tell me that woman wasn't a person, a mother. And I feel like I can shout and scream all I want, and they won't listen either. I can write to you over and over again, telling you I didn't mean it. I can tear up the page. I can tear up the page with words, whisper until my throat is raw, and it wouldn't change anything. I feel like you've already made up your mind about me. Have you? Is it like Neji says, and I'm fated to be stuck with the mantle of assassin? Please give me something, give me anything. I can't ask you to forgive me. How can I even forgive myself? Just please help me. End of chapter 7.